Okay, there we go. All right, hi everybody. Welcome to the January 3rd instance of SIG API Machinery. There is nothing on the agenda at the moment, so what would you all like to talk about?
Well, I do know one thing that I think I'm going to pursue for 110. I think that we now have fairly significant experience with the Cube aggregator APIs. OpenShift's been using them for almost a year, Service Catalog for about 6 months, the metrics server for at least 3 or 4. I think I'm going to push on that to become V1.
Are there any things you want to change for GA, or is this a rubber stamp?
I'm putting out. I'll put out a call here. I know some people here are involved, and I'll get up with Solly and the metric server guys to ask. And Paul Morey for Service Catalog is local to me. But API wise, it seems to be doing fairly solid.
Okay. So you're happy with the service reference mechanism?
It seems to be working okay. The use cases for running them off cluster, it's still possible to do. It's not easy. But since it is targeted at since it is only used by the Cube aggregator, which already has access to lookup services and endpoints, I'm not concerned about it from a permissions perspective.
Okay. That's fine with me. Yeah, I'd like more stuff to go from beta to GA in 2018. So
yeah,
fine with me. One of my reasons is that I feel like the extensibility stuff has to be. It's not really very useful unless it's universal across all Kubernetes clusters. So I want it to be GA so that there's no reason not to put it in conformance tests and stuff. So I really want that to be universally consumable in any conformant Kubernetes cluster. And it's kind of hard to tell people, yeah, you really have to make sure that this works in your platform if it's just beta. So yeah. Anyone else have things to say? Did anyone here learn anything at KubeCon they ought to talk about?
I could maybe talk a little bit about some etcd things, maybe after the KubeCon stuff.
Okay. I'll say at KubeCon, I met at least 3 people interested in using the Kubernetes API Machinery to host Kubernetes style APIs that didn't necessarily need a cluster. So I don't know what that means for us yet, but that's something to think about, that there are people out there who, if we packaged up our API Machinery nicely, would probably use it. So if we want to, I think I've also heard Tim and Michael Rubin had a talk about shifting from to a distribution model for Kubernetes where there's distributions and a kernel, and we work on the kernel. I think if the project does go down that route, and I think it probably ought to, I think there might be a lot of value in us packaging our or making API Machinery a more reusable component, so that we ship a deliverable that then goes into the Kubernetes project, rather than being the current state where everything is sort of meshed together. Something to think about. I don't think there's any actionable items on this at the moment, but just be aware that we're thinking about it.
So
we probably can't hear you, Walter.
Sorry. So one thing from the cloud provider side in KubeCon, we're hoping to bring Cloud Controller Manager to beta in 110. As part of that, I'd like to get some pretty significant refactoring done on the controller manager machinery. I'm not even sure what the right SIG is for owning controller manager.
Yeah, that's actually a great question.
Historically, we have owned it, right? We did the informers, we did the initial caches, we did the Delta FIFO,
Yep.
we did the actual command to give it the structure of a controller context and an initialization. We owned naming them and providing config for them and managing their flags. So we've been pretty deeply involved there.
No, we definitely have, but at the same time, I think it's been sort of sitting on the wayside, and a lot of people have been touching it, and I think there's some tech debt to pay off, and I want to get some of that pay.
We've definitely done a lot of work on it, and like the people in the room have done a lot of things for it, but I don't know that we've done that in like as an official capacity of the SIG.
I think the Cloud Controller Manager, when it split out, it basically had parity with the Controller Manager in a lot of ways, good and bad. And a lot of the improvements that we've made to the Controller Manager in terms of standardizing the startup flow and the context and the isolating the controller loops and things like that did not keep pace in the Cloud Controller Manager. So Walter, were you talking about kind of bringing the Cloud Controller Manager up to speed with kind of the lessons and approaches learned?
Yeah, so what I'm envisioning is abstracting some of those very significant improvements you're talking about into sort of a generic controller manager, and so that they can then be brought into the Cloud Controller Manager, and we won't have this problem where the Cloud Control Manager is a copy. It should actually be using the same core library to do a lot of its work.
Yeah, I think we haven't like owned it, but we've done a lot of work, and I don't see anybody else stepping up to or any other SIG stepping. I don't even know what other SIG it could logically fall under. So I'm fine with like annexing it, and I don't know that it really should fall under our jurisdiction in perpetuity, but at the moment there's stuff that we would like to change there, and I don't know who else is going to do it. So
yeah, but yeah, that is definitely where I'm thinking of starting, and then there are a few related items where I want to make some improvements on both sides. But yeah, the first thing I'm envisioning is bringing the Cloud Controller up to parity by sort of abstracting out what should be common code and making it actually common code.
I guess I do have a question more than a concern. We should consider whether we really want to encourage the pattern that we have in our controllers, right? Like the default would be, sure, our controllers work fine and we use them, but do we really want to encourage the pattern that says you have more than one controller per process, or do we want to have something that says you have a logical unit of function and it runs in its own controller, and once you get past the core controllers that Cube provides by default, you should be trying to run them in pods on the platform in as small a unit as possible.
So I think why not both is my answer there. Like, why do we run multiple controllers in one process? There's a lot of problems with that. Like if one controller crashes, it breaks the whole cluster. I think the only legitimate reason I'm aware of is that it's for efficiency, right? It's like because
the only reason we did it is historical, right?
Well,
I mean,
no. There's a good reason.
It's not trivial, yeah.
There's a good reason, because many of the controllers keep an entire cache of all objects of some type, and they're overlapping, so it's much more efficient to host them in one process.
Well, and what I will say is that I think your concern is a good one, but if we can get out sort of a generic controller manager logic that can then be reused, it becomes much easier to then work out good fault lines where we can start splitting the controller manager into logical pieces that are affiliated along the lines that Daniel is suggesting.
Yeah, if you have a library where you can say this you just give it a list of controllers and it runs those in a binary, then it becomes very easy to make as many binaries as you want.
Yeah, David, were you arguing strongly for the single controller per binary or just as the limit?
So
I think David was arguing strongly for it.
no, the single controller per binary there is some significant conceptual purity to it. It makes it fairly easy to understand what's happening with your system. There's never a discussion of, well, if this controller dies, should I kill the process or am I better off running the other 4 that are running here? It's just a straight up, yeah, it died, it crash looped. You should.
Yeah, even some of the things we have to do in CI, like run the cache shared informant mutation detector, like those are sort of hacks that we do so we can sleep at night knowing that probably things aren't touching data they shouldn't. But
Yeah.
if we're, so it just makes it easier.
I agree with that. I just envision the changes I'm taking are, they're not going to get us to what you're talking to, but they're going to make it a lot easier for us to get there.
Okay, I guess what I'm saying is not that I don't want you to do that refactor. We shouldn't do that refactor. What I'm saying is that before we try to publish a generic controller library, we should consider what we think our guidance should be and whether what we really want is to provide something simple that'll give people sort of standardized kind of flags, a standardized little server that will let them look at metrics and pprof and what's currently active in health.
I mean, I don't think we have to publish this right away. Like we have 2 binaries that both need to work sort of the same way. I think it's totally fine to go make them work the same way and then reflect on that and publish.
Okay. So before we get to the point of publishing, I would like to have that discussion of where we think we should end up. I'd like to have that discussion, and we can talk about things like, from an operational perspective, are we better off together or separate?
Yeah, that sounds fine, and I don't know that doing it in this meeting is the best place for that.
That's also okay. I just want to make sure that it's on your mind.
Yep.
Before we go to do it, we're going to have another talk about what shape is best. We have some battle scars now.
Yeah, that seems reasonable.
Okay, cool. Anyone else?
I think this year, one thing.
Is someone talking?
Yeah, you is very far from the microphone though.
Yeah, one thing we may want to do is the more features to make CRD more feature complete. So probably it should be on our agenda, but exact timing and what kind of features we want to do, that's up for debate.
Yeah.
I think I heard that. It was more features for custom resource managers. I wasn't sure if it was specifically directed at Nikita, who I think I saw on this call, or not.
Yeah, I'm here. So for CRDs, currently for 1.10, we're just planning sub-resources. And otherwise, there is a plan for field selectors as well, but I don't think that's going to go for 1.10.
Right. So we're currently looking at scale and status, as I recall. Those have accepted designs and implementations in progress, as I recall from you last year. Is that
So
right?
actually,
Are these custom sub-resources, or is this like an opt-in thing for the common ones?
Opt-in and go ahead.
Nikita.
Yeah, it's just an opt-in thing. Yeah.
What was the second thing you mentioned, Nikita?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
What was the second one that you mentioned?
Status and scale sub-resources. After that, field selectors.
Field selectors.
Yeah.
What do field selectors mean to you?
For me?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the idea technically is to provide a whitelist of selectors in the CRD spec, but I mean, it's going to need a design proposal, and I haven't fleshed it out yet.
Okay.
But it's going to take time.
So is this so you can search custom resources with field selectors?
Compared to current list API. So you know how you can list, and when you do a list, you can say, I want events that are only from this source, or I want pods that are only scheduled to this node, or
Yeah, this is something that we should maybe have a more in-depth conversation on, because right now field selectors are not implemented in a very efficient manner. So I don't know if we want to encourage, given the way they're implemented right now, I don't know if we want to encourage people to make heavy use of them. Hopefully the name and namespace are supported. I think we support those for all resources.
Yeah. So this is Frank. I don't have. I'm not sure how the current field selector implementation is, but is it very static and hard coded? Because technically, if it was like dynamic and discoverable, nothing would technically need to be done to search on field selectors.
Yeah, it is.
It's very static. It's very hard coded.
Yeah, the current supported field selectors are hard coded and not discoverable.
And the evaluation of them is inefficient. So
It's not versioned either.
they are versioned in a very weird way, but they are versioned.
That's what I mean. There's no guarantee that the value you put in is actually the value that gets filtered against in some cases for some.
Yes, that is
so
true.
It sounds like field selectors would have to be re-implemented anyways in that.
Yeah, and then there's a danger that we end up implementing like an entire database system.
Yep.
So, we should sort of figure out where we want to go here. Like, do we want to turn this into like an arbitrary, efficient query system? Do we want to be happy with a few hand-selected queries?
We have not received as much pushback on the limited set of field selectors for core resources as I would have anticipated 3 years ago. There are definitely use cases that don't work as well, but the majority of people who are dealing with resources do tend to use controller caches, which is the biggest mitigation.
Yeah, but that's not great for the whole system, right? To have everybody with a whole copy of everything.
But we have survived for 3 years. Is it the biggest problem we have right now? I don't know.
That's why I want to talk carefully before working on it right now.
Yeah.
So the other thing for custom resource definitions was the dynamic webhook validation. Was that proposal approved, or is it not approved yet?
Still under review, right? There are outstanding questions. There are outstanding questions about if you've already granted the thing that is creating the custom resource definition the power to create an arbitrary RBAC role. Do you actually think you're restricting it by saying you can't create an admission registration directly? Like, so there's some fundamental questions like that. Like, from a security perspective, you haven't limited its scope. You think you have, but you really haven't.
Yeah. For now, I think the webhook validation. For now, the webhook validation lets you accomplish this functionally. The design to inline it or trigger it off of something within the CRDs could enable more use cases where you have. I agree with David. It's kind of an odd case where you're letting someone contribute types to the global registry, but you don't trust them enough to register a webhook. That's an odd place to be.
I don't really understand why that is. Like, if you would only let them register a webhook for the type that they are added in the CRD. Like, that's very different than letting them register a webhook for anything, which is what the current API allows.
So in order for your custom resource definition to be useful, you end up creating a role to go with it. The vast majority do that, right? But in order to be able to create the role, you have to pass an escalation check. To be able to pass the escalation check, it means that you're able to create essentially an arbitrary. If you're able to create an arbitrary RBAC role, and if you're able to create an arbitrary RBAC role don't you already have super privileged powers?
Okay.
And if you already have super privileged powers, what are we defending against? It's that the whole story, when put together, seems to require more permissions than
So are you saying that the same person that could apply a custom resource kind could also just update the custom resource definition?
No. The person loading the custom resource definition is presumably the same one that wants to load something that will define the webhook validator for it. And
Correct.
that person to create the definition and create accompanying roles and permissions that let people use those custom resources, that implies high levels of permission currently.
But I thought,
and this is trying to carve up those permissions specifically for the webhook validation without also looking at, well, you're going to need higher permissions to set up roles for this kind and other resources for this kind. So when we look at the whole picture, it's not really worth going and doing a lot of work to let them carve up one piece of that story if they're just going to need high permissions to do the other 70% of the story.
Maybe we need to automate the role creation process too.
Yeah. So I thought one of the only reasons why we're even considering doing webhook validation in the custom resource spec is because currently you can do the exact same thing with admission controller webhooks, but the reason we did it is because we wanted a way for people to do it that didn't have cluster admin privileges.
Right, that's the point. This would be something inside the CRD that would drive, under the covers, a validating webhook config scoped to that CRD.
Right.
So the question is, if we go do this, have we actually made it possible for someone who is not a cluster admin to define CRDs and associated permissions and validation in a useful way? And I think there's more, there's probably a lot more that would need to be done in addition to this before we could actually get there. And so we just need to decide if doing this work now makes sense.
Yeah. Why wouldn't you just leave that up to the cluster admin to decide whether they want to create an RBAC policy to prevent someone from creating a CRD?
Because we have to do this work to enable things inside the CRD spec and then hook up controllers to turn those into validating admission webhooks. So it's work that we're signing up to do, or someone is signing up to do. And the question is that worth doing if it doesn't actually provide isolation?
Okay, so sounds like I need to go look at that proposal again. Has David or Jordan, have you left comments on it?
I scanned it. I didn't leave any comments on it. I actually saw, as I was about to leave my comment, Stefan said exactly the same thing.
Okay, I'll go.
High-level meta question, and in my consideration of it, I think I look at it and I say, I think the only one who's going to be able to do this is a cluster admin.
Yeah. So if it is in fact true that you have to be a cluster admin to install a CRD today, then this doesn't seem to be helping people too much.
Yeah, that is the case with default permissions today, by the way. In order to be able to create them, by default, only cluster admin can do it.
Yeah, so, so I'm not sure why. This
doesn't really differ from an admission controller.
This is Brendan's baby, so I'm not sure, yeah, so maybe we should, I'll go take a look at that and leave comments.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say it wasn't obviously. You consider the whole story, and then it's,
Okay, I think we spent enough time on that. Anything else?
Yeah, I had one where Phil Whitrock and I were having a debate on server-side printing. So Phil and I are trying to reach conclusion on one side or another of what the resolution for that is. So we had planned to meet when he gets back and then do some discussion in SIG CLI. But just so folks are aware of that if we can reach closure, then we would like to move to beta in 1.10. And there's another issue for it, which is the partial object metadata stuff for garbage collection. There was a discussion about moving that to beta in 1.10 as well. We actually talked about it in 1.9, but we didn't reach a conclusion on it. So both of those were, in theory, things that I would like to target for 1.10.
Sorry, what was the second one? Server-side printing and
partial object metadata, just getting objects and just getting their metadata back.
The thing for garbage collection and namespace cleanup.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there, do you need more eyes on the server-side printing thing, or do you think you're
Phil and I are going through all the, like, a lot of it I think would be interesting to many of the folks on this call, because it's about what is the minimum bar for generic things on a client, and then it's the trade-off between user experience. Like, you can't make good user experiences necessarily just by using JSON path and trying to sort through that. So it's a little bit more about SIG CLI and UX, but I will certainly make sure that any discussions we have include this group. I think it's about just reaching a conclusion that we're happy about for what's the right thing for end users.
Yeah, it's more like if you think the conversation is stuck, maybe additional people can help. But if you don't think it's stuck, then I'm happy to let you guys argue.
Yeah, and like we've been coming back and forth with ideas like virtual fields and how do we communicate more complex abstract concepts around the API to clients. And sub-resources were one thing for that, and sub-resources are limited. So I think we'll probably pull up a lot of topics that have been discussed. I will try to make sure that everyone here gets a say. If anybody has any concerns about server-side printing or opinions, ping me and I'll make sure you're included in any discussions.
Cool. All right. Any other topics going once?
So the other missing feature of CRD. Something we want to do.
Version conversion on CRDs. That's kind of a can of worms. I'm not sure.
I saw an issue for it, but I saw no design outstanding for it. And I don't have particularly clever ideas.
I mean, as it stands, I think it's like I don't think there's any reasonable amount of effort we could apply to have that actually happen. So somebody has to have a clever idea, I think.
Some of the conversations around defaulting are actually sort of on a small scale, touching on the same issues. So a lot of the ways that defaults get applied to objects today on normal API objects is that they're done at decode time. So when you submit an object to the server, if you omit a field that has a default, that field gets defaulted on its way into the server. And if it gets persisted in etcd, and then in the next release, a new field shows up with a default, the next time the server reads that object out of etcd, it will apply that default. And so that sort of default on read behavior means that when you read objects out of the API, you can count on all the fields with the defaults being populated. A lot of similar issues come up with conversion. And so if you're interested, I would actually suggest jumping into the defaulting CRDs poll and kind of seeing what questions are being raised there, like how we can do it efficiently, whether we have to start maintaining, like start modifying things as we read them out of etcd and like persisting those changes back, and like modify on read starts getting really weird. A lot of those things are going to be similar with conversion.
And we ended up holding that poll, as I recall.
Yeah, we're still stuck on what the right answer is for those.
Yeah.
Just so that no one gets too hopeful. Like, yes, we discussed the same issues. No, we did not come to a good answer.
Yeah. Yeah, we should also, maybe we need to think about how much we protect people from themselves with CRDs. Like clearly, if you have a webhook that does defaulting, not that I think that's a good idea, but if you had a webhook that does defaulting and then you go and change that webhook, you've probably broken yourself. Yeah, so
Yeah.
We need to think about how bulletproof our tools need to be before we release them. Yeah, we should also maybe think about what is version usable for CRDs. Maybe we can give another solution for the same problem. Like the actual problem that people have is I have version 1 and I want to move everybody over to version 2. How do I do it? Maybe we can come up with a alternative mechanism that gets people where they need to go without actually doing some strange conversion operation.
Anyway, to my knowledge, this doesn't yet have traction for this year.
I don't know if I'd say the year. Definitely not the quarter.
Another topic, server side. So there was some discussions with SIG CLI, and I don't think there's anybody from SIG CLI on this call to represent. Discussions on server-side validation. So being able to avoid having to have clients implement a full open API syntax validating engine in order to verify that objects are correct, as well as server-side apply, which is probably a longer discussion. I think that this is probably the next SIG CLI meeting I'll bring up and make sure that they at least represented. But those are two server-side things that we've said we would like to move to the server that I haven't seen traction on in the last release or two.
And to be clear, the validation stuff is like pre-decode or as part of the decode step. So right now the CLI is catching things like you specified the same key twice, or you specified a key that I don't have in my struct. So this is like way early in the decode chain. And actually has implications for backwards compatibility as well, like submitting objects with new fields to a 1 version old server. Like we can't just reject those requests. So it's unclear to me like how you would, like what you would do with that. Would you have to opt in to having those rejected, and who would do that?
The proposal at least had covered opt-in, but just so other folks, like I don't know if there's anybody else on this call who has looked at those more recently than someone on SIG CLI.
Yeah, and the server-side apply, yeah, I still haven't seen something that looked like it was going to be particularly effective across version SKUs.
Phil and I had talked about like a three-way merge type of API where you submit the old and new and ask the server to provide the current and do the merge for you. So rather than trying to compute a patch format, you give the server your old and new. And that way the server can convert. The server has the ability to convert those to a coherent version.
But the server still ends up having to build a patch at some point, right?
But then you don't have a patch format.
Right. Only one party needs to understand patch application computation
Okay.
instead of
I could
two.
accept that, but I'm still not convinced that the patch formats that we have today do what we want them to do.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of strategic merge patch. I think it's not very principled, and
both of the proposals for server-side apply involved not dealing with patches.
Okay.
You say, this is what I think should be the truth, or as Jordan pointed out, this is what I think should be the truth, and this is what I think the previous version was, and it becomes a server version-specific problem.
So the server never tries to compute a patch. It just says, this is what I think the result should be.
Right, and then the client, like it removes some of the burden from the client, specifically version tracking, but there's other things that now become, like Jordan pointed out, with optional, which is, do I want, like, how do I override? And in most cases, it'd be like, okay, well, I'm going to fall back to put. Well, how do I fall back to put correctly, et cetera?
You could either do that, or it can be like standard three-way, like here's old and new, and I prefer yours, I prefer mine, or I prefer fail on conflict. Like, I don't know. We have options.
I think there may still be a use case for patch formats. Like the garbage collector wants to remove something from the owner reference list. Like I shouldn't have to send multiple objects to do that. I should be able to say, there's this one field. I don't care what's in the rest of the object, but change this one field this way.
Yeah, but that's less of a computed patch, and that's more like a crafted, like here's the patch directive to set this field or remove this item.
Yes.
The patch is an intent versus the computed patch is not an intent. It is a best effort kind of. We hope we got this right.
Yeah. I think the patch language should really be a series of like right now. I think our strategic merge patch is a really shitty scripting language.
JSON patch is actually closed. It just doesn't have the ability to reference things by items in a list by key. You can only reference by index, which doesn't work.
If that was the same feature in strategic merge patch, wasn't that right? It was the idea that.
Well, clearly, all we need to do is come up with an RFC.
I brought this up over a year ago and said we need to find a smart guy to figure out how to write the right patch, and not it.
We're still looking.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. We're 40 minutes in. Maybe we should call it a day.
I do have one question here. This is Matt Freno. Sorry about my voice. That's why I haven't spoken up earlier. It's the thing that I lost over the holiday.
Yeah.
One of the things that came up at KubeCon was the idea of a separate Go client from client Go. It was discussed in a few circles, and I wanted to formally bring it up here because y'all own client Go. I understand that it's part of Kubernetes. It's had to evolve a lot, and it regularly changes interfaces. A lot of it isn't documented well because there is so much change and churn going on, because that's needed inside of Kubernetes. But for those who are building applications on the outside to interact with the API, that's become a big frustrating point. And they've been patient for quite a while. And now the conversation has turned towards, do we need a separate one? And if we don't do it, people on the outside are starting to create their own. And I know there's been a point of the Kubernetes client org, and let's have our clients over there and see what we can do. But because there is client Go, we're not doing something over there for this, and yet people are getting frustrated and started to create their own because it's taking a while to become a usable thing on the outside. And when I asked, could we get that in 2018? Get it rounded out with fewer or almost no API changes other than adding for new objects and object versions, and just kind of maturing it out and then getting the documentation and the experience and all of that into place. I was kind of told it's not high enough on the radar that it's going to happen. Wow. And so this conversation has kind of come up in a few venues where a number of people are really interested in it. And it'll probably happen outside in the ecosystem somewhere. Actually, it's already starting to happen there. And so now it becomes, can our stuff, does it still need to use client Go? Can we use ecosystem thing like with Helm version 3 coming out? Should they switch to something that's not part of Kubernetes because there's a bunch of pain points in converting? How do we approach this? And so I wanted to raise the question here because it's already being talked about elsewhere.
Now, in your idea of a separate Go client, are you talking about a simple Go client does basic CRUD and REST operations, or are you talking about the other pieces of client Go, things like the reflectors and the queuing mechanisms and the informers and the listers and all the other pieces that are required to make, say, a client like a controller, or are you just talking about basic CRUD?
Well, I guess it kind of depends on what it ends up growing into. It'll probably start with basic CRUD operations, but if you're going to write a CLI, what features does it need? Or you're going to write an outside application, it would grow to have those.
No, the CLI only has CRUD. So I guess what I would say is our client Go is actually a lot like our basic controller toolkit, right? This is a client that you need to be able to write a solid controller. And that's what our client Go grew into. If there is instead a request for just like a typed generated client, I don't know that it would actually bother me to have the community build their own, right? If they build it based on Open API, why not?
So let me ask this though. What if a tool like Helm, which is part of Kubernetes, wanted something else? Should it go to the community because we're not supplying it instead of client Go? Like, how does that end up working out? Or if Kube Control, which is looking at making lots of major changes in the next couple of years, wants something simpler that just meets its needs? Could it switch? You know, what do we do with that?
I mean, something like Kube Control, a lot of the push there is to reduce its dependence on types and make it deal with generic things generically. And so it's actually switching more and more to use like unstructured objects and pull data down sort of opaquely from the server. A lot of the things we're trying to move logic to the server, like server-side printing and server-side apply, and so it is dealing less and less with types and more with unstructured data. And so you want me to create something? All right, I'm going to decode this and post it up and then deal with the status I get back. And so you can actually already do that with client Go with unstructured objects, and you lose the niceties of the Go type system, but you gain insulation from changes. There are also two types of changes. There are type changes and API changes for the Kubernetes API, but then there are the actual Go changes, like how you call the client methods and things like that. And so what I hear is more concerned about the latter. And we've talked about that's kind of a function of the generators that we have. Even the client Go stuff that's there now is generated. And so every time we change the generators, those change the Go APIs that people have to write to. And so we've talked about regenerating client Go against updated schemas using the various versions of the generators that we have. And that would let people pick up new fields, new API objects, but keep using the same Go APIs.
We talked about that downstream, not upstream. I still think it's a good idea, but I didn't think we had realistically considered it here because of API machinery.
No, we talked about it.
Okay.
I think to me that seems like the lowest friction approach to give people access to new types and structs and fields without making them rewrite their programs.
Yeah, because right now the issue is if, you know, when the new version of Kubernetes comes out, somebody's going to spend days figuring out what happened in client Go because the changes aren't well documented and there isn't a lot of documentation targeted towards an end user. And so they're going to take days to figure out what changed and then how they need to rewrite their programs. And it's not just client Go. They end up pulling in API machinery because client Go ends up leaking API machinery types. So you've got to understand a little bit about that. And now there's the API package. So you're pulling in those three. You got to understand what changed in those, and then you end up working to this. And that ends up every quarter when we do a release and somebody wants to update, that's, you know, days of time just to update for the new version, even if they have no functionality change.
I think that's a little bit of an exaggeration for some upgrades. Like the 1.7, 1.8 upgrade was bad. I definitely grant you that. But I don't think 1.8 to 1.9 is going to be nearly that bad.
I've already had people come and complain to me about it. And that's the reason that I'm back here again. I mean, people have openly said this is a problem and I'm frustrated with it. And I have to do it every quarter.
I mean,
So as
I would love help making it better.
There are two things at play here. One is like the actual API types themselves, as of 1.8, are in the place where they're going to be. You can use those and decode things directly into them, and as much as you limit your applications to dealing with those types, you are insulated from changes around API machinery and things like that. New fields come into those objects. Occasionally, there's a change that affects those, but those are very, very slow moving. To the extent that you are using the other helpers and things that David was talking about, informers, things like that, yes, if those change, you have to react to it. And that's why being able to republish old not old, but previously generated versions of Client Go with only schema and field changes would keep people from having to touch anything in their application. That's what I'm saying would be a reasonable place to explore.
Yeah, I think that's a good first step.
We should be very close to that. And if you look at our old proposal documents in the client, they call for splitting the Go client into a Go base, which is like the dynamic type, the unstructured type, the REST client, the Informer, like the Informer library, and a set of generated repositories. And if we had that, then you could generate a there's a cross product of the Kubernetes version and the client library interface. And right now we fill in only the diagonal, and there's no reason why we couldn't fill in the entire grid.
That's not completely true. So I actually experimented with it in OpenShift a while back to see if I was going to be able to do it. And a lot of it comes down to whether the generator tags have changed, the annotations that you use, and whether new things are present, and whether the API machinery has changed enough that the types are no longer valid. And in the previous releases that we've had, something generally changes between those releases, and it breaks. So it's not that, I wouldn't say that it's super close. There's a reason OpenShift didn't do it to start out, right?
Yeah, we could, for example, provide a backwards compatibility guarantee. Like, we'll keep a particular client interface up to date for 6 months or a year or something like that.
I guess what I was trying to explore with my question to Matt of exactly what he needed is that if he only needs the CRUD, if he needs something that'll work for a CLI or for something that runs on a small scale and not like a full controller, then having someone generate basic CRUD with their own types, they don't have to match Kubernetes types. There's no reason for them to. There's no reason to have it go through API machinery. There's no reason to have that dependency at all. Having them generate their own client based off OpenAPI, I would not stand in the way of that at all.
I'm like, knock yourself out. Go for it.
But here's the thing. Here, let me come back to the end experience, though, because we're talking a lot about how we build things. And so as a developer who's building an application that needs to work with the Kubernetes API, I want to be able to import a package and then use that package. And over time, the API to the package might change in an additive way for new types that I get to deal with as Kubernetes introduces new types and versions, but the structure and the format and massive changes won't be happening to the structure of it. And then you layer in documentation and examples. This is what somebody expects in a client, right? Who's going to consume it, whether they're working on kube control, Helm, something out in the ecosystem, right? They don't want to go take a bunch of files and generate their own client. They just want to say and go import this package, and it works, and it's nicely versioned, and I do minor version updates, and I get new features such as new types that came in a new version of Kubernetes. And ideally, because of the way our type system works, I could point it at a 1.9, a 1.8, and a 1.7 cluster, and it would know how to talk to each of those without having to match types to stuff.
I think you're asking for like a rule where we never break users, and we don't have that rule right now.
But I mean, you said someone's already actively working on it. I mean, that seems like a healthy ecosystem. I mean, I guess I'm looking at it and saying if somebody else is already doing that and generating it and providing it, that sounds like a net good thing for us.
But the kind of direction is that the clients should come from the Kubernetes organization, not happen in the ecosystem. And I've heard that more than once. And so if Helm, which is a Kubernetes project, for say, doesn't use Client Go and goes and uses something that's not part of the Kubernetes ecosystem, what does that say? Is that kosher? Is it not? Like, how do we approach this if the general volume is saying, no, you should do this? If there's a problem with Client Go, we go fix Client Go to make it better so it meets these kinds of use cases.
So what is hidden here is that by making Client Go behave that way, we are breaking use cases of having it update and react to changes in the types and the API machinery that is developing. And so the cost of that is breaking the current use cases that Client Go is meeting. So I think it's all about like what do you value? If you want to write a point-in-time application and never touch it again, then you probably don't want to be using the Client Go that is keeping up to date with changes in API machinery. If you want to write something that is able to keep up to date and you want to make it work against newer, if you write your application, it will continue working against the Kubernetes API even on a newer server, because our APIs accept requests from older clients. But what you're wanting is both, not you, but what the request is, I want to take advantage of new features and not have to react to changes that come along with those releases. And right now, that's not realistic, given the way Client Go is built.
That's not exactly what I mean. They want to be able to take advantage of new features and new properties and things like that, but they want it in an additive manner, not a breaking change manner. So instead of like when Client Go comes out for every new version of Kubernetes, right, it's a major API breaking change. So you've got in Semver, you got the first number changing. They would like to see things be in an additive manner where it's a minor version upgrade because it's feature additions. And then those feature additions know how to talk across different versions.
Yeah,
which
sometimes that's possible,
kind of
sometimes it's not. And I mean, just in terms of a Go API, every change is a breaking API change. If you add a field to a public struct, it's a breaking API change, depending on how people constructed their structs. Like every change is a breaking API change, technically. And again, many changes that go in are additive. You know, we have a new option in list options that says include uninitialized. Does that break people? No, it was additive. Other changes are not. You know, it's a new parameter to a function, and doing that in a way that would let people keep calling the old function with the old signature makes the Client Go API sort of nonsensical. And so our priority has been build a coherent API. And if people want to keep using the old versions of Client Go, they can. If they want the new features, sometimes that comes with signature changes. Not always. And like we said, the more just standard CRUD stuff you're doing, the less you're likely to be impacted. Typically, people are impacted when they're sort of using the full gamut of informers and listers and reflectors, and like the more and more of API machinery you are using, the more exposed you are to changes, but the more value you're getting.
I think the fundamental request is a good one, and I think the code base is just not mature enough to lock down to that degree yet.
So at what point would it be mature enough?
So I have one comment on the generated Open API based generated one. So even the Open API based generated Client Go, as Jordan said, it's not always backward compatible. By adding fields, it wouldn't be backward compatible. The changes would be less definitely than the Client Go that we have right now, and more mechanical when you generate a new client. My stand on this is I'm not sure if we are ready to support an Open API Client Go right now, but we should support Client Go, the Go base repo, and make it very easy for people to generate Client Go and use config loader and simple things to to generate their own Client Go using our gen repo and all of those stuff. I think we should do that, but I'm not sure if you're ready to support an actual Client Go.
Matt, you asked when you think we'd be ready. Timeline-wise, the work that has happened in 1.7 to 1.8, we were finalizing the locations of the API types. 1.8 to 1.9, a lot of work went into the generators, and some of that required annotating and putting more information into those API types. And that was what David was talking about, where you can't actually take those back to a 1.7 generator and say, hey, just generate updated schemas for me, because we are actually still building out those generators as the information needed to generate the clients is finalized. What is being generated now is done in a much more principled way than it was previously. As that gets finalized, I expect the rate of change in the API types and annotations to slow. And as that slows, we will be able to continue generating clients with updated schemas and types back several versions more easily.
Yeah, because once you have that, then we can start layering in documentation to actually explain how to use things. Because one of the most frustrating things that I also hear is I have to go read the code to know how to do stuff. And that's a really hard thing for people who just want to use the API. They don't want to learn how this works. And so the next step is then to really detail and explain how everything works. And you got to have stability to be able to do that well. And so
not necessarily. So we can generate documentation. The generators are producing code. They should produce documented code, and then we can generate.
So nicely, like tutorials. Here's how you go do something
with examples.
And explain it with examples.
Yes.
So as a user of Client Go, I've never had to read the code. Godoc has provided me everything I've needed
to know how to use it. Now, do you also work on Client Go, or are you just a consumer?
I'm just a consumer.
Okay.
Now it did take me a long time to figure out how to auto-generate code. Like I had to like Google and find some blog article that pointed me here and here to like actually find the code gen project. But
yeah, this is where
I think our effort is best spent trying to finish stabilizing the generators and get it to the point where we can continue generating against new API types with old generators as quickly as possible, and make sure that what we are generating includes documentation and examples.
I mean, I'd like to do that, but would you actually stop someone from creating their own?
No, absolutely not.
I mean, I'd like to see the new blood. I'd like to see what comes out, what concepts they have, and whether it's better.
Yeah.
And
Honestly, the people here on this call are mostly back-end type engineers, and I think client library, like ultimately the best client libraries are we're probably not the best people to like make super user-friendly client libraries. We'll probably get there eventually, but if history is any guide, we've still got a lot more rearranging. Like we're still adding wheels to the bus and taking them off, and while the bus is moving. So, I like let 1,000 flowers bloom. If other people make clients, great. I think in the process of making a client, you will discover why there is much of the complexity in Client Go. Like when you want to implement the exec call or get logs out of your pod or process a kubeconfig file or watch a resource, like there's a lot of code that goes into doing those things, and it's not super easy to use, but it's all there for a reason.
Yeah, and I think people understand and they respect that. Their problem is just the practicalities of using it with the release cycle as often as it comes out, and all of the changes to the Go API that they interact with, and the difficulty with navigating the documentation and the changes and the upgrades they have to do. That becomes the burden. They understand that there's a lot of complexity here, and they appreciate that it's been created. But now it's just this regular every quarterly burden that they're putting on and having to deal with, and that's the frustration, and it builds over time every quarter that they have to go do this. I mean, if things settled down and documentation came into place, I'm sure they'd be much happier and they wouldn't want to go. It's that external user experience that they're interested in.
Yeah, all right. We are over time. This is a topic we're thinking more about. I don't know that we have easy answers.
And Matt, I will reach out to you. I want to discuss this more with you. I will send an email and we'll set up a meeting.
I had a couple of things I wanted to mention about etcd, but maybe we'll wait for the next time since we are already over. Okay.
Cool. All right. Thanks, everybody. And I will stop the recording.